Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this afternoon's webinar. A webinar of a few hours that will talk about the Harmonized European standards, drafting the standards compliant with the EU legislation. You are many this afternoon to follow us, so please welcome to everybody. My name is Els, and I will be moderating this webinar in the background, as usual. And I will tell you, first of all, what are the housekeeping rules for this webinar. As usual, you're all muted. We have to do that because you're so many. So please use the Q&A panel to enter your questions. And then the speakers will bit by bit have a look at the questions in the background and provide you with the answer if possible during this session. Should your question remain unreplied, please do not worry because we intend to make a Q&A report available via the website for your information and sharing, of course. We will also send you the presentation right after this presentation, including the link to the recording of the full webinar. So please let me introduce now one of the first speakers, in fact, our Director Standardization and Digital Solutions, Cinzia Missiroli, who will welcome you to this webinar. Please, Cinzia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ernst, and welcome everyone. I'm very pleased to see that there is such a huge participation to this webinar, so much that we had to schedule a second one, and that will take place on the 6th of July with the same content. The objective of this webinar is really to provide the support to our technical committees and to all our experts in order to develop standards that have a likelihood to be accepted for a citation in the official journal. The development of harmonized standards and the citation of those in the official journal is really one of the key strategic activities of CEN-CENELEC. You are part of the CEN-CENELEC family, and the CEN-CENELEC Management Center is really there to support you in achieving this goal. And this afternoon is really dedicated to you, to provide you with the tools, with the latest updates on the what is needed, and on based on recent discussions that we had with the European Commission, and also recent developments that have taken place at the technical board level. So my team will be with you the whole afternoon. Please don't hesitate to submit your question. As was saying, those will be answered via either directly today or in a separate document that will be distributed and uploaded for your availability. And so as you see, this today is really meant to be a framework webinar, a framework training that goes from the basic elements related to the new approach, the new legislative framework and the standardization request, the HAAs assessment system, and then we will go into more technical aspects related to the elaboration of harmonized standards, the drafting aspect, including those standards developed in the framework of the Vienna and Frankfurt Agreement, as well as the citation of standards in the official journal. So overall, we estimate this webinar to last a couple of hours, but I said, and we try to cover all these within this time frame. But I said, don't hesitate to submit your question, and those that are not addressed today, they will be. Don't worry about that. And then, without further ado, I leave the floor to my colleagues, and I really wish you a very fruitful webinar and a lot of interesting information. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cinzia, for this welcome. I would like to give the floor immediately to Catherine Vigneron, our Account Manager, Energy and Living, who will talk you through the new approach, the new legislative framework, and the standardization requests. Please, Catherine, can you maybe start sharing your screen? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Els. So let me just share my screen. Voilà, I hope you can see my screen now, and it is my pleasure to make the first presentation of this webinar today. So the idea is to briefly present you the frame in which CEN and CENELEC are developing standards in support of EU legislation. But to do that, let's just go back in time and give you a very brief overview of the EU product harmonization legislation and how we arrived to the new legislative framework that is today currently in place. So first, and this is the content, in fact, of the presentation. So first, let's go to the first slide. So in the past, we had the old approach to the European technical legislation, and that implied that the technical requirements were defined in the legislation, which concretely means that national authorities draw up legislation. That legislation does not or did not prevent barriers to trade within European countries. And in 1985, there was a council resolution on a new approach to technical harmonization of standards, and that opened the door to the elimination of barriers to trade for different types of products through technical harmonization. And the directives following that format were called new approach directives. And this is a term we are still using today. And in fact, these directives are based on a total harmonization, since they replace, in fact, diverging national legislation. So the new approach deals with a large family of products, from machinery to construction to toys, etc., or horizontal risks such as the EMC, so electromagnetic compatibility. And the new approach is really a method of harmonization used for most industrial products. But let's go now and see the principle of this new approach. So, in fact, new approach directives define essential requirements, health and safety. And these essential requirements, as you know, are the requirements that product must meet to be put on the market. These essential requirements are then mandatory. So the essential requirements indicate what should be achieved, but without specifying how. Essential requirements are therefore written in those directives in such a way that they can remain valid in time and do not become obsolete when there are some technical progress. And then there is a reference to standards. New approach directives foresees that CEN and CENELEC, following a standardization request given by the European Commission, but I'll come back on that later, elaborate European standards which offer, in fact, technical solution to meet the essential requirements mentioned in those new approach directives. And these standards are called harmonized standards and give presumption of conformity. Another important aspect is that product manufacturer in compliance with those harmonized standards benefit from what we call presumption of conformity with the essential requirements of the directives. Then we have the new legislative framework. This is the term we are using now, I mean, at least since 2010, because it was the date it entered into force. And in fact, the new legal framework does not change the new approach principle, but improve it further and improve the EU product harmonization legislation in terms of overall coherence, in terms of definition of some legal principle, conformity assessment, but the basis of the new approach remains. In terms of legislation, but I'm not going into the detail, the new legislative framework that we often use the acronym NLF. As you know, we are all speaking in a jargon and acronym. So NLF is new legislative framework, but we'll do our best today to use the full word. So in terms of legislation, the NLF, the new legislative framework, is consisting of 3 pieces of legislation, but the most important one for CEN and CENELEC is written here on the screen, but I will not go into the details. This was just to give you the link between the new approach and the new legal framework. In the next slide, here you'll see a visualization of the link between the legislation and the standards. So on top, you have the legislation, which is of course mandatory. It sets the goal. And below, you have the standardization part, really the standards. And what is also crucial to note is that even if prepared in support of EU legislation and even referred to in the official journal of the European Union, standards remain voluntary. And I mean, the standards, what we call European standards, are the standards developed by three organizations: European Standards Organization, CEN, and ETSI. And this is clearly mentioned in another piece of legislation, which is the Regulation 1025 of 2012 on European standardization. If I go to the next slide, this product harmonization, as said, covers a large range of products. You see from very important sectors. You see here the list, as said, from machinery to construction, going to medical devices and railways, etc., etc. It is to be noted that standards developed in support of this new approach directive, new legislative framework, have some specificities. I will not go into the details here because we have a full afternoon to discuss all these aspects, but I will just give you the list because it helps also to frame the situation. So first, standards developed in support of identified pieces of legislation needs to be assessed. To assess whether the standards are compliant with the legal requirements set in the directive and the regulation. So we have some details later. Second, these standards needs to have what we call an Annex Z. Here you see on the screen Annex ZD, Annex ZZ. It's because in CEN we call this Annex ZD and in CENELEC an Annex ZZ. So this annex, in fact, is a page at the end of the standards which make the link between the health and safety requirements mentioned in the directive in support of which the standard is drafted, and the clause of the European standards which support those essential requirements. Another important point to note is that only when cited in the official journal of the European Union, European standards give presumption of conformity to the essential requirements mentioned, the essential requirements of the directive pieces of legislation covered by the European standards. And as said, the application of harmonized standards remain voluntary. There are other ways to show compliance with the health and safety requirements. So that was the theory, just give you very briefly the frame in which CEN and CENELEC are developing harmonized standards. And let's now jump in the second part of the presentation, which is the standardization request. In fact, it is where everything starts for you, dear technical committee officers and experts. Indeed, harmonized standards need to be developed in the context of a standardization request issued by the European Commission. What is a standardization request? It is a request, somehow a political wish, let's say, from the European Commission to CEN and/or CENELEC to develop and to adopt European standards in support of European policies and legislation. It is an official Commission implementing decision. So this is an official document asking us to develop standards in support of a specific pieces of legislation. If you go to the graphical explanation of it, this is, let's say, the visualization. On the left-hand side, the Commission developed the standardization request. Then you see the arrow, CEN and/or CENELEC develop the requested standards, which are then offered to the European Commission for citation in the official journal. This is in a very, very short graphical visualization what we are doing when we received a standardization request. But let's start with the standardization in the present, in this presentation, and then my colleagues will go to all the other part of this graph in the next presentation. So let's start then with the standardization request. First, standardization requests are mentioned in a document that is called the Annual Union Work Programme for European Standardization. So it is an annual document available on internet. If you type, you'll find it. So it's an annual document published by the European Commission and identifying each year the strategic priorities for the Commission in terms of standardization. This is really where we can find the first reference of any new standardization request. At that stage, it is, I mean, it's a wish, it's an idea, somehow it's a strategic direction, but we do not have any paper at that stage. It's really a plan, it's kind of starting point. Then there is a development process of, there is the development process of the standardization request. This development, I will not go really into the details now, but the development in this is described also in a document called the European Commission Vademecum on European Standardization. But I just wish to insist on some very critical aspect of the development of a standardization request in which your role is super important. So when it is in the annual, the document is in the annual union work program, there is a development, a development asset described in the Vademecum from the European Commission. And what is very important in the development of a standardization request is that it is clearly mentioned everywhere that the development of a standardization request is to be made in consultation with stakeholders. In that context, of course, SEN and SENELEC are key stakeholders and are invited to comment on the draft standardization request. When we received the first draft, we, the SENELEC Management Center, immediately set up what we call a standardization request ad hoc group. Nice acronym, SRAG. This group, and the secretariat of this group is held by CCMC, by the SENELEC Management Center, is in charge of coordinating the SEN and SENELEC position towards the draft standardization request in terms of technical feasibility, of available expertise, etc., etc. And this is really at that stage that SEN and SENELEC can really influence the content of a standardization request. And this is where we need you, where we need your help, we need your input. That's why we are establishing this group. We are calling our members to send us delegates in that group. So this is really where we can really, as said, influence a standardization request, tell the Commission what is possible and not possible. Really, this is a very, very important step. And that's why we did believe that mentioning that today would be relevant for you. So this is very important. So we established this SRAG, so standardization request ad hoc group. What is important also to know, without going too much into the details of the standardization request, because as said, this is not the purpose of today, but a standardization request, when it has finalized, let's say, its development, where we have contributed, when our comments were or were not taken into consideration, approved or not. At the end, let's say, when finalized, a standardization request is voted by the member states first in a committee that is called the Committee on Standards. If if the opinion of this group is positive, the document, let's say the standardization request, is submitted to SEN and SENELEC, and or depends from the topics, for acceptance and rejection. What is very important to know is that we do have 1 month. This is mentioned in a regulation, the standardization regulation, that we have 1 month to reply. What is also, rather important to note is that the standardization requests have an expiry date. And if the project, the work item that you wish to develop in support of a legislation is not mentioned in the standardization request, then we will never be able to offer it for citation to the in the official journal of the European Union. So that's, coming back, to my last slide, to the previous slide. This is also where we need your input. When we receive a draft standardization request, this draft is always accompanied by an annex with a full list of standards mentioned in it, and which is, let's say, the standard that the Commission wants us to develop and to offer offer for citation in the official journal. So if you spot, I mean, already during the development of the standardization process that your new work item or your project is not in and should be in, you need to please let us know. This is very important because, as said, if not in, impossible to offer. Of course, when we have accepted a standardization request can be revised, reopened. But this, a revision of a standardization request require a full approval process of, full development process of it's a new standardization request somehow. So it can be quite long. And what is also interesting for you to know is that all the standardization requests are available on a database, a Commission database, so that you can, if you are not yet familiar with it, you can have a look to it. If I'm not wrong, before giving the floor to my colleague, just to give you a bit of look and feel of a standardization request. So on the left-hand side, you have what we call the core of the text of a standardization request, which is, let's say, a two-page document, relatively similar for many, for the various sectors, it's quite similar. And then on the right-hand side, you have the annex of a standardization request. This is very important because this is really what the Commission is asking Senenc to develop. And this is, I said very important. If you spot that, if you notice that your work item is not in, problem, so tell us and we will see what we can do. As said, a standardization request can be reopened, but it requires a full approval process. That was it from my side. I hope that it clarifies a bit the frame in which we are developing harmonized standards, that you get that standardization request, even at the very, very beginning, is already very important for you to take into consideration when developing a standard. And I give the floor to my colleague for the next presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katrien, for sharing this useful information. I see that people started putting in questions already, and I also see that the colleagues are answering them on the spot, so that's good. Thanks for that. I would like to ask you to do the same, Katrien, if questions are more related to what you have been saying. So without further ado, please, Nuno, I would like to invite you to update the attendees on the HAAs assessment system.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can see well the presentation that I just shared and that you can hear me and see me well.
Sorry, Nuno, but we're seeing, in fact, the duplicate slide. So we see the next slide already. Can you maybe arrange that we only see
I don't know how to...
You're working with two screens?
It's off, my monitor. My screen is off.
Okay, but did you unplug the cable as well?
No.
Maybe that's a problem. Yeah.
Okay, we'll try. So I hope now we'll be fine.
Yes, that's it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that, Els. Thanks for your help. So yes, as Els already introduced, the goal of this session of the webinar is to give you a recap and an update on the HAAs assessment system. And I will also give you some guidance on what to do in case there is a lack of compliance received at formal vote stage, but of course, more from a procedural point of view. I will start with the HAAs contractor as a recap. As you know, the HAAs contractor is Ernst Young, who is responsible for managing the HAAs assessment system. The contract between EY and the Commission started on the 1st of April 2018, and it will expire on the 31st of March 2022. So this means that next year there should be a new contract. So the Commission should launch a new tender to find a HAAs contractor that should start in theory on the 1st of April 2022. But we will, of course, discuss with the Commission as well how this will be put in place. The HAAs contractor is the formal contact point towards the Commission and the European standardization organizations like CEN and Senelec, and EY has 3 main tasks. The first one is administrative and logistical tasks to coordinate the work of the consultants, including, for example, the recruiting and the allocation of the consultants to the different assessments or the work orders. The second task is on horizontal verifications and checks of non-technical nature. So they always check, for example, if the request was correctly made by the ISOs. But they also check in projects online whether the work item, for instance, is correctly allocated to the legislation and the standardization request. The third task is the evaluation of the assessment results and the effectiveness of the assessment concept, meaning that, for example, after the consultant concludes his or her HAAS assessment report, Ernst Young will still make an horizontal quality check to ensure that everything was done correctly. At last, the HAAS contractor, as you know, manage the pool of HAAS consultants. It means that it is the responsibility of Ernst & Young to decide who is going to be the consultant to assess the harmonized standard. Of course, the HAAS consultants are allocated per specific sector according to their own expertise and according to the technical committee. So there is an allocation of HAAS consultants to technical committees, and normally this is followed. The HAAS consultant is an independent expert hired by Ernst & Young, and there are 2 main tasks for the HAAS consultant. The first one is, of course, to assess the harmonized standards against the standardization request and the EU directive or regulation. And this should be 80% of the time of the HAAS consultant spent on the assessment of standards. 20% of the time of the HAAS consultants is allocated to communication between the HAAS consultant and the technical bodies. Normally, these mean exchanges, meetings, and interactions in order to give advice on how to improve and solve the lack of compliance HAAS assessment. So, as you know, the Commission has recently decided to temporarily suspend the meetings between the HAAS consultants and the technical bodies because of limitations of the HAAS budget for the HAAS project. But we have received the information from the European Commission that they have found additional fundings that should be available somewhere at the beginning of July. And this also means that the HAAS assessment system will be restored back to normal, and it will be possible to have meetings again between the consultants and the technical bodies as of, I hope, July. So this is very good news. So as a general remark from my side, remember that when the meetings are possible, it is very important, following a lack of compliance assessment, that you exchange with the consultant to solve the HAAS assessment with lack of compliance. So when can HAAS assessments be requested? There are 4 stages. The first one is optional, is the first working draft. Even though it is optional, it is strongly recommended that you request the first working draft HAAS assessment. Remember that it's very important to receive the comments from the consultant as early as possible during the development of the harmonized standard. And by doing this, you are also increasing your chances of receiving a compliant assessment at inquiry and formal vote stages. Then the next stage when it is possible to request a HAAS assessment is at inquiry stage, which is a mandatory stage. At formal vote stage is also another stage that is mandatory for the HAAS assessment. And then very exceptionally, and following a lack of compliance at formal vote stage and after the closure of the formal vote, it is possible to request a publication HAAS assessment in very limited cases, and just to ensure, for example, that the Annex Z is correct. Remember that technical comments cannot be taken into account after the formal vote, so the pub assessment should be requested exceptionally and normally for the particular for checking the Annex Z only. That should be the main principle. Now remember that there is only the possibility to have one HAAS assessment per stage. So in case you receive, for example, a lack of compliance assessment at formal vote stage, it is not possible after the technical committee revises the document to include the comments from the HAAS consultant, to revise it and then submit for a second formal vote HAAS assessment. So unfortunately, this is not possible, and we need to stick to one assessment per stage only. In terms of duration, from the moment that we make the request to Ernst & Young for the HAAS assessment of a standard, normally they have 35 weeks to deliver to us the HAAs assessment report. And we can also say that this target is constantly met by the HAAs contractor, meaning that we haven't seen many delays in delivering the HAAs assessment reports. This slide is, in my opinion, very interesting because you can see very, very graphically the interactions of the HAAs consultant in the different stages of the development of the standards. And in this case, we have included the flexible standards development process aspects. You can see that for the different stages, you have as well the different time frames allocated, and you have the legend in the right side down. The main point for you to have in mind is that, of course, we have the 3 different assessments, first working draft, the inquiry assessment, and the formal vote assessment. The latter 2 takes place before the inquiry of the formal vote is launched, but mostly important, it is important to highlight that it is the European Commission at the end, once the standard is published and once we offer standard for citation, it is up to the European Commission to assess the standard and decide whether the standard can be cited in the official journal or not. If not, then we will receive normally a formal letter with some feedback, and this feedback is shared with the technical committee for further improvement or for providing some justifications to the European Commission. But we will touch upon this part in a different session of the webinar today. In terms of outcome of the HAAs assessment reports, we have, of course, compliance, and this means that the standard, in the opinion of the consultant, can be cited in the official journal. We have lack of compliance, and in this case, it means that the standard cannot be cited in the official journal, and the consultant would suggest then to take into account his comments in order to make the standard citable. In the past, we used to have partial compliance, but this was something deleted by I guess, the Commission and Ernst Young because it caused some confusion. So now there are only 2 possible outcomes: compliant and lack of compliant. The HAAs assessment reports are available on the CEN and CENELEC BOSS pages. Whenever you are drafting an harmonized standard, I would suggest that you take a look at the HAAs assessment template so you can have an idea of what are the items that the HAAs consultant will look at when assessing the standards. I would, of course, when you receive a HAAs assessment, if it's lack of compliance, of course, you need to look at all the comments that you receive, but I would ask you to pay particular attention to the HAAs assessment report item 1.2 on the critical findings leading to lack of compliance, because these are the most important aspects that prevent a citation according to the consultant. In terms of outcome, you can see here that you have the compliance box to be filled, and within the compliance, you have 2 additional boxes. One of them must be filled by the consultant. If the consultant considers that the standard is in very good shape, then he or she marks good or good for compliance document. If the consultant still considers that it's compliant with some minor or limited changes required, normally the TC can take this into account, but if the TC decides not to take this into account, this should not prevent citation of the harmonized standard in the official journal. Then in terms of lack of compliance outcome, there are 2 boxes. The consultant needs to fill one of them. So we have a minor or limited number of changes required. For example, just some small modifications required in the Annex Z, or the consultant could mark as well that redrafting of the standard is required. And this means, of course, that some work has to be done in the point of view of the Commission by the of the consultant by the technical committee. So where can you find the HAAs assessment reports? So we have a dedicated HAAs platform on LiveLink. It is divided into 2 main folders, one for CEN and one for CENELEC. And inside each of these folders, there are 2 subfolders, one called to be assessed, which is the folder that we CCMC use to request HAAs assessment requests to Ernst Young. And then the the assessment results folder is used by Ernst Young to upload the HAAs assessment reports when they are finalized by the consultant, and also for the TC secretary and for CCMC to download the HAAs assessment reports. What is important is also that the TC secretary sets some notifications. So the procedure is that you should go to the HAAs results folder, either for CEN or CENELEC. Then in the arrow, you click in the arrow and then you have a drop down with many options. You should go to set notification, and then you should select how often you would like to receive these notifications. Could be hourly, could be midday, could be weekly. So this depends on you. Of course, you should set the notification in the folder of the technical committee where the reports will be made available, and you should repeat this if you follow, of course, more than one technical committee. In terms of procedure for requesting the first working draft HAAS assessment, first, the TC secretary needs to submit to CCMC the first working draft document. In the transmission notice, which you have a print screen here on the slide, the TC secretary also needs to feel that there is a need to have a HAAS assessment of the first working draft. And this transmission notice, together with a standard, needs to be submitted to CCMC. Then it is the CCMC project manager that will submit the request to Ernst Young. What is important is that you remember that in the first working draft, you already include a first draft of the Annex Z. For parallel work, the first working draft is the committee draft. It is also very important that you liaise with ISO and IEC for requesting the committee draft HAAS assessment. And my colleague will give you further information on this parallel work later on during the webinar. Of course, when the HAAS assessment is available, is put on live link by Ernst Young. And then in case you receive a lack of compliance, which I would say that it's quite normal at the beginning of the drafting of the standard, remember that you can organize a meeting with the HAAS consultant whenever, of course, this is possible. So we are still waiting for the information for the commission, but let's imagine it's already possible. Remember that even it's in a very early stage, it's possible to organize a meeting with a HAAS consultant in case you receive a lack of compliance. In terms of procedure for the inquiry HAAS assessment, in case of homegrowns, the technical body secretary needs to submit the PREN document that includes the Annex Z to CCMC for inquiry procedures. It is important as well that the TC secretary also submits a checklist for harmonized standards. And this is a new element, and I will come back to that in the next session of this webinar. And after the editing phase, the CCMC editor will request the HAAS assessment at the same time that he or she will request the translation of the document into French or German. And again, we make the request, and Ernst Young will make available the HAAS assessment report on LiveLink. If the HAAS assessment report is compliant, and if all the criteria are met, it is possible to skip formal vote. And what is the criteria? The criteria would be to have a positive positive result, weighted vote of the inquiry. And remember that if there is a wish to skip the formal vote, technical comments received at inquiry stage cannot be taken into account in the document. So this is an element that you need to consider if you think that you would like to skip the formal vote. In case of lack of compliance, of course, the launch of the inquiry is not delayed. So in other words, we don't stop the inquiry, the process continues. Of course, after the inquiry closes, the technical committee will have to consider the inquiry comments received, also the comments from the consultant, and then the recommendation in case of lack of compliance is, of course, to organize a meeting with the HAAS consultant to solve the issues and agree on a way forward. So communication with the HAAS consultant is key and important to solve the assessment of the standard, and also increase the possibilities later on at formal vote stage to have a compliant assessment. The procedure for the formal vote HAAS assessment, the beginning is very similar to the procedure for inquiry. For homegrown, the technical body secretary submits the final draft together that should include the Annex Z, of course, and the checklist for harmonized standards. And now there is a new element that the technical committee needs also to submit, which is the inquiry HAAS assessment report. And in the last column that is called observations of the secretariat, this last column must be filled to indicate how the consultant comments have been addressed by the technical committee. And I have included here on the slide a typical example of a TC, of a HAAS assessment report with comments from the consultant, from the TC on how the comment of the consultant will be addressed in the standard. 1 second. So the CCMC editor, after concluding the editing of the standard, will request the HAAS assessment and request at the same time the translation into German and French. And once the report will be available, of course, will be put in place in the respective folder of live link. In case of compliance, this is good news, of course. The standard can proceed to formal votes, can be published, will be offered to the Commission for citation. In theory, the standard should be cited in the official journal, but there will be still an assessment of the Commission, of course. In case we receive a lack of compliance, we need to follow the procedure that is described in a BT decision on the HAAs assessment system. So the focus now on these slides will be on homegrown standards, and my colleague will further elaborate for the parallel work in a different session of the webinar. So in case of a lack of compliance at formal vote stage, the follow procedure needs to be put in place. So the first one is that the formal vote is suspended for a maximum period of 12 weeks after the reception of the assessment. So in other words, it means that if you receive a lack of compliance at formal vote, we don't launch the formal vote to give you some time to decide, to assess the comments from the consultant and decide what is the best way forward. The next step is that the technical body secretariat and the BT member and permanent delegate of the NSP and National Committee holding the secretariat shall be informed. And finally, the technical body has 7 weeks to decide on what is the best way forward. In order to solve a lack of compliance HAAs assessment, this is the recommended procedure for the TCs to follow. First, of course, the TCs need to, the working group normally need to discuss the HAAs assessment with lack of compliance, discuss the comments from the consultant, and then needs, or it is recommended to prepare the following 2 documents. The first one is the HAAs assessment report with the last column filled, called observations of the secretariat, to indicate how the TC is addressing the comments from the consultant. Then another document that the TC needs to prepare is the revised draft standard in track changes, showing the changes made by the TC in comparison with the first, with the formal vote draft version, which received a lack of compliant assessment. So it's very important that these 2 documents are prepared. The TC secretary should organize a meeting with the HAAs consultant. It's not mandatory, but we highly recommend to exchange with the consultant as much as possible to solve the assessment. Before the meeting takes place, it is important that the TC secretary provides the documents highlighted here on the slide under 1A and 1B to the HAAs consultant in order to prepare the meeting, to have a meeting that is smooth and is and to have an efficient meeting, and that the consultant is aware of how the TC is planning to tackle his or her comments. After the meeting takes place, the TC records the outcome and asks the consultant whether his or her comments have been sufficiently addressed in the revised text of the harmonized standard. This can be done at the end of the meeting. Of course, if this is the case, if the consultant gives feedback, this is registered, should be registered in the minutes of the meeting. Otherwise, it could be done after the meeting via email. This is also a possibility. Following the outcome of the meeting or the interaction with the consultant, the TC needs to agree on the way forward. One of the possibilities is, of course, the TC revise the final draft standard in order to tackle the comments from the HAAs consultant to solve the lack of compliance assessment. So then the next step would be that the TC needs to submit the revised document to CCMC for formal vote. If there are some supporting documents, they need to be provided as well. And then the TC would conclude that the HAAs assessment has been resolved, and what CCMC does it, we try, of course, to support the TC as much as possible. We will as well mark in the database, that our database, that the HAAs assessment has been resolved. In this case, if the formal vote is positive, the standard is published. It will be offered to the Commission for citation. Now, remember, we will offer something to the Commission with lack of compliance. So it is very important to show to the Commission some evidence, some documents indicating how the TC has decided to tackle the comments from the HAAs consultant. I'm referring in particular to the 2 documents that I just presented in the slide before. Another possibility after the meeting with the consultant is that the TC, looking at the outcome of the meeting, looking at the HAAs assessment report with the formal vote lack of compliance, decides that there is no need at all to change the content of the final draft standard. What is needed to do is to just adapt or revise the Annex Z. If this is the case, the TC secretary needs to submit again the final draft standard with the revised Annex Z to CCMC for formal vote. If the formal vote is positive, again, the similar step as before is valid. The harmonized standard is offered to the Commission for citation. And then again, we are offering something with lack of compliance, and it is important to show some evidence to the desk officer that the TC did take into account the comments from the consultant. Now, very exceptionally, in this case, as I said earlier, and in very limited cases, after the closure of the formal vote, it would be possible to request a pub HAAs assessment. And the idea is not for the consultant to take a look at the content of the standard. The idea would be that the main goal is for the consultant to have a final check on the Annex Z. Remember that if we ask a pub assessment and we receive technical comments, then we cannot proceed to publication because we cannot include those comments, and it means that the standard has a lack of compliance. However, if we receive a lack of compliance assessment and the only comments from the consultant would be on the Annex Z, remember that it's still possible to revise the Annex Z via a BT decision, provided that, again, the BT then would agree with that request of the TC. Another possibility after the meeting with the consultant is that the TC decides to temporarily deharmonize the standard, and this happens sometimes because there are way too many comments received from the HAAs consultant that is difficult to take into account in the draft standard. So if the TC decides to go in this direction, the TC needs to take a decision, then to the BT needs to take a decision that must be a request to the BT to remove the Annex Z and any link to legislation. If the BT approves the request from the TC, the standard then will be, so the Annex Z of the standard will be removed, and we will proceed to formal vote, and the standard will be published, and the CCMC project manager will have to get in contact with the EC desk officer to inform that we are not gonna offer the standard for citation. Then, at the earliest convenience of the technical committee, they can launch a CIB for the approval, or CIV for the approval of a new work item to initiate the amendment or the revision in order to solve the lack of compliance assessment, with the intention now to bring harmonization to that standard again. Another possible outcome is that the TC decides to permanently deharmonize the standard. The procedure is very, very similar, or basically exactly the same. The difference is that there is no step foreseen in a short term for the TC to create a new work item, to revise the standard, and to try to harmonize it again. So in this case, we don't offer the standard for citation. And then finally, as the outcome of the meeting with the consultant, and from my experience, I have seen this happening sometimes, is that the TC decides to abandon the work because there were way too many significant comments from the HAAs consultant, and therefore the TC decides that it's not possible to progress the standard to formal vote, and in this case, the TC takes a decision to abandon the work item. The BT must approve the request from the TC. If it is approved then by BT, then our colleagues from data service will abandon the work item in the database. And then at the earliest convenience of the TC, a new work item ballot could be launched for approving or initiating an amendment or revision to, again, to work on a standard, to solve the comments from the consultant. And the goal, again, is to publish the standard as harmonized standard. Now, on a different topic, just as a reminder, in case a TC receives a lack of compliance as assessment, and if the TC disagrees with that assessment, it is possible to request Ernst Young to review the assessment. So in this case, the TC secretary needs to send a request to CCMC with a very good detailed justification, and then CCMC will make the request to Ernst Young, who has 3 weeks to reply with a reviewed assessment. In terms of time frame, at inquiry, there is no really a time frame for requesting a review of the assessment. However, for formal vote, lack of compliance assessments, if the TC decides to request to review the assessment, this must be within 4 weeks of reception of the assessment. And again, this is not happen too often, but if the TC decides to go in this direction, this should be very, very well justified. In terms of requesting meetings, this is again a recap. If the TC wants to have a face-to-face meeting, hopefully this will be possible soon, or a virtual meeting that is more than 4 hours, the TC secretary needs to make the request via a dedicated Ernst Young link, and you have here the print screen of that link. So it's a survey that must be filled by the secretary. If the technical body would like to have a meeting that is a web meeting that is less than 4 hours, they can contact directly the HAAS consultant. There are some practices that are not allowed because the Commission and Ernst Young considers that they go beyond the tasks of the HAAS consultants. So firstly, the TCs cannot request directly the HAAS consultant for an assessment. So this has to be done via the formal assessment process via CCMC. A second point is that the TC, the HAAS consultant cannot help the TC in drafting specific clauses of the standard and cannot as well participate in the consensus building activities of the TC. The fourth point is that the HAAS consultant needs to follow the instructions of the European Commission. So this means that any guidance related with the application of some EU regulation or a directive needs to be agreed with the European Commission. At last, we were also informed that after a final pub assessment, it is not possible anymore to have meetings with a HAAS consultant. So this is different than the formal vote HAAS assessment, to which it is possible to have a meeting with a consultant. To conclude my session, and this is the message that I would like you to remember of my session after this presentation, is that first, please remember to request as much as possible the first working draft HAAS assessment. Again, it's optional, but it's very much recommended. As soon as you get the comments from the consultant, the easier it will be later on to achieve a compliant assessment at inquiry or formal vote stage. The second point is exchange as much as possible with the HAAS consultant. Interactions is key in order to agree and decide on a way forward. And when meetings will be possible again, and as I said, normally this should be, according to the Commission of the information from the Commission, should be in July, please start organizing the meetings following lack of compliant assessments. Before such meetings, remember to prepare the right documentations, the HAAS assessment reports with the remarks of the TC on how the comments from the consultant will be addressed, and also the revised standard in track changes, and submit these documents to the HAAS consultant before the meetings take place to organize well the meeting, to have a very efficient meeting. And lastly, normally we should only offer to the Commission standards with a compliant HAAS assessment. However, as I just explained, and because also we only have the possibility to have one HAAS assessment per stage, it is possible under some conditions and exceptions, if we see that the technical committee has addressed all the comments from the HAAS consultant, to publish the standard, even though the result was negative, and offer the standard to the European Commission for assessment and for citation. So this was, in a nutshell, a recap, an update of the HAAS system. And if you have questions, of course, I'm more than happy to reply to them. And then I will pass the word to my colleague that will start with the next session on the elaboration of harmonized standards. Sorry, there is a coffee break. I didn't foresee that.
Yes, no, thanks for this. I was about to say that we intended to have a small break here. We should, I think, decide how long we keep it. What about 3:05? 10 minutes? Is that okay?